Every old person knows what it is to be young, but not all young people know what it means to be old. They think age is a fog that settles over the brain, making the world blurry and the mind slow. They see the silver in my hair and the deliberate way I place my teacup, and they assume I am a statue, a relic of a time they've already archived in their history books. They don't realize that when you move slowly, you see everything. When you are silent, you hear the things people only whisper to their reflections. 12 years. That is how long I have lived in this house on the corner of Oakhaven Drive, a street where the lawns are manicured with surgical precision, and the secrets are buried just as deep. For 12 years, I was the lovely Mrs. Adelaide, the woman who bakes lemon tarts for the neighborhood association and keeps her hedges trimmed to the exact inch required by the bylaws. I was a fixture, a piece of the scenery. And for 12 years, I was a ghost to the one man who thought he had exorcised me from his life. It was a Tuesday when the knock came. Not the frantic rapping of a solicitor or the rhythmic pulse of the mail carrier, but a heavy, entitled thud. The kind of knock that belongs to someone who believes they own the air they breathe, and yours, too. I didn't rise immediately. I let the vibrations settle into the floorboards. I finished the page of the book I was reading, a technical manual on soil acidity, though most would have expected poetry. Only when I had placed my bookmark did I smooth my apron and walk to the foyer. Through the frosted glass of the door, the silhouette was unmistakable, broader than it used to be, perhaps a bit softer around the middle, but the posture was the same, the aggressive tilt of the chin, the restless shifting of weight. It was Elijah, my late husband's nephew, the man who, a decade ago, sat in a mahogany-paneled office and explained to me, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, why my inheritance was legally complicated and why I would be happier in a smaller, more manageable residence. He hadn't seen me since the day I walked out of that office with nothing but my dignity and a single suitcase. He didn't know I had spent the intervening years watching. I knew about his failed real estate ventures. I knew about the gambling debts he masked as investments. I knew about the cracks in his perfect, polished life. I opened the door. The air between us didn't crackle. It froze. Elijah looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw the boy who used to hide his broken toys under the porch. Then, the mask of the successful businessman snapped back into place. "Aunt Adelaide," he said, his voice dripping with a forced, oily warmth. "It's been a long time. You're looking well." "I am looking at you, Elijah," I replied softly. My voice was a calm river, hiding the jagged rocks beneath the surface. "That is more than enough." He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped over the threshold, his expensive leather shoes clicking on my hardwood floors he didn't realize I had polished myself every week for 12 years, waiting for this specific vibration. He looked around my living room, his eyes calculating the value of my silver, the age of my rugs. He thought he was looking at a praise den. He didn't realize he was standing in a laboratory. "I'm in a bit of a situation," he began, leaning against my fireplace mantel. "Family business. I thought it was time we put the past behind us, forged a new path." I sat in my wingback chair, the one positioned perfectly to catch the light and to keep him in the shadow. I didn't offer him tea. I didn't offer him a seat. I simply folded my hands in my lap and watched the way his pulse jumped in his neck. He was sweating. A man only comes to the woman he robbed when he has run out of people to lie to. "New path, Elijah?" I asked, my tone conversational, almost pleasant. "Paths are dangerous things. One wrong turn, and you find yourself exactly where you started. Or worse, exactly where you deserve to be." He chuckled, a dry, nervous sound, always so cryptic. "I miss that about you." He was lying. He hated it. He hated that he couldn't read me. He thought my silence was a sign of weakness, a symptom of an aging mind losing its grip. He didn't know that my silence was a countdown. "I need you to sign something, Adelaide," he said, reaching into his briefcase. "Just a formality, a clarification of the old estate papers. It would mean a great deal to the family." I looked at the gold pen he held out. It was a beautiful instrument, expensive, sharp. I looked from the pen to his eyes, and in that moment, the 12 years of quiet observation consolidated into a single cold point of clarity. He thought he was here to finish the job he started a decade ago. He thought I was the final loose end in his tapestry of deceit. "Put the pen away, Elijah," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming something heavy and ancient. "You didn't come here because of a formality. You came here because you are drowning, and you think I am the only piece of wood left floating in the water." The smile slid off his face like grease. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of the things he thought I didn't know. But I knew. I knew everything. And as I looked at him, I realized the game hadn't just begun. It was already in its final moves. He just hadn't noticed the board yet. "Why don't you tell me the truth?" I whispered. "It will be the first time in 12 years you've used it. I promise it won't kill you." "Not yet." I saw the flash of anger in his eyes, the arrogance of a man who still thinks he is the hunter. He stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. It was his first mistake of many. "You should be careful how you speak to me, Adelaide," he hissed. "You have a nice life here. It would be a shame if complications arose." I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I simply leaned back, the shadows of the room embracing me like an old friend. "Complications have already arisen, Elijah," I said. "You just haven't looked behind you yet." The clock on the mantel chimed, a slow, deliberate sound that felt like a sentence being passed. Elijah opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat as a low, persistent hum started from the street outside, a sound he didn't recognize, but one I had been expecting for over a decade. Elijah thought he had walked into a house of dust, but he had merely stepped into a trap 12 years in the making. If you want to see how the rest of the machinery unfolds, subscribe and like this story. The quietest people often have the darkest secrets to share. I'm curious, though, as I sit here in the silence of Oakhaven, where are you watching from? Tell me your city in the comments. I like to know how far the shadows reach. The sound from the street was rhythmic, a heavy, mechanical idling that Elijah couldn't quite place. He walked to the window, pulling back my lace curtains with a proprietary tug that set my teeth on edge. He expected to see a delivery truck or perhaps a neighbor's gardener. Instead, he saw a black sedan, unmoving, its windows tinted to a charcoal void. It sat exactly 30 feet from my driveway, positioned in the blind spot of the street lamp. "Who is that?" Elijah asked, his voice losing its polished edge. "The world is full of people we don't recognize until they decide to show us who they are," I said, not rising from my chair. "Perhaps it's just someone admiring the architecture, or perhaps it's someone waiting for a debt to be collected. You'd know more about that than I would, wouldn't you?" Elijah turned back to me, his face pale in the dimming light of the afternoon. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was thin, like paper tearing. "You've always had a flair for the dramatic, Adelaide. It's just a car." "Is it?" I tilted my head, because for the last 3 days, that just a car has followed you from your office to that little club on 4th Street, the one with the side entrance, and eventually here. They've been very patient, almost as patient as I've been. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the silence of a polite visit. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. Elijah dropped the curtain. He didn't look like a predator anymore. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized the floor beneath him was made of glass, and he had been stomping on it for years. "How do you know where I've been?" he whispered. "I have a lot of time, Elijah," And I have friends. Not the kind of friends you have, people who smile at your face and sharpen knives for your back. I have friends who remember what your father did to this neighborhood. Friends who remember the widow you left with a lien on her house while you bought a third car. We are a quiet community, but we have long memories. I stood up then. My knees didn't creak. I moved with a fluidity that seemed to unsettle him. I walked to the sideboard and poured a glass of water, the crystal clinking softly. I took a sip, letting the coolness settle. You came here for a signature. I continued, my voice conversational. You need my name on a quitclaim deed for the property in the valley. The one you told me was worthless 10 years ago. The one that the city just rezoned for a multi-million-dollar commercial hub. You're over-leveraged, Elijah. Your creditors aren't asking for interest anymore. They're asking for blood. And you thought your old, senile Aunt Adelaide would be an easy mark one last time. He stepped toward me, his hands balling into fists. For a moment, the quietly dangerous mask I wore was tested by his raw, desperate aggression. You don't know what you're talking about. You're a lonely old woman in a drafty house. Give me the papers, Adelaide. Don't make this difficult. I didn't move. I didn't retreat. I looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time in his life, he saw not a victim, but a strategist. I already signed them, I said. His eyes lit up with a predatory spark. Where are they? I didn't sign them over to you, Elijah. I signed them over to a trust managed by a firm that doesn't take no for an answer, and certainly doesn't take bribes. The property is gone. It's been liquidated. The proceeds have already been distributed to the families you've spent the last decade ruining, including mine. The color drained from his face until he looked like a waxwork. The aggressive posture collapsed. He reached for the back of a chair to steady himself. You couldn't have. I checked the filings. You checked the filings under your name. You didn't check the filings under the maiden names of the women you stepped over. You forgot that I wasn't always an aunt. I was an accountant before you were a thought in your father's head. I know where the decimals go, Elijah, and I know how to make them disappear. I walked past him toward the kitchen, my footsteps soft and deliberate. Now, I believe you should leave. That car outside, they aren't mine. They're the men you owe for that investment in the docks. I imagine they've lost their patience. But don't worry. I've called the police. He let out a breath of relief, a pathetic, shuddering thing. Thank God. I paused at the kitchen door and looked back at him over my shoulder. The light caught the silver in my hair, making it look like a crown of thorns. Oh, Elijah, I said softly. I didn't call them for you. I called them because there's a suspicious man trespassing in my home, and I told them he was armed and unstable. You should probably put that gold pen away. In the dark, it might look like something else. The sirens began in the distance, a faint, wailing promise of the chaos to come. Elijah looked at the front door, then at the black sedan, then at me. He was caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, and I was the one who had choreographed the tide. 12 years, I whispered, loud enough only for the shadows to hear. And it only took 12 minutes to undo you. The flashing lights of the patrol car didn't bring the comfort Elijah expected. They bathed my living room in a rhythmic, jarring pulse. Red, blue, turning his expensive suit into a costume of vibrating colors. He looked smaller now, the bravado leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. He stood paralyzed between the window and the door, a man who had spent his life navigating boardrooms and was now lost in a room of lace and dust. You're bluffing, he hissed, though his eyes darted toward the porch. You wouldn't risk it. The scandal, the police in your house. You've always hated a scene, Adelaide. I hated your scenes, Elijah, I said, moving to the mahogany desk in the corner. The loud parties, the crashing cars, the way you shouted over your dinner. I don't mind a scene when I'm the director. It's quite a different experience. I opened the top drawer. It slid out with a smooth, oiled hiss. Inside wasn't a weapon, but a stack of ledgers, physical books with handwritten entries. In a digital world, people forget that paper is the most permanent witness. They think if it isn't on a server, it doesn't exist. They forget that ink doesn't have a delete key. Do you remember the summer of 2014? I asked, my fingers tracing the spine of the oldest book. You told the board that the pension fund for the warehouse staff had been misallocated due to a banking error. You cried at the funeral of the floor manager who couldn't afford his heart medication after his coverage lapsed. I was there, Elijah. I was the woman in the black veil in the third row. You thought I was mourning the man. I was mourning the math. The sirens were closer now, the wail bouncing off the brick houses of Oakhaven Drive. Neighbors would be peering through their blinds, their curiosity piqued by the sudden intrusion of reality into their manicured lives. Elijah took a step toward me, his hand reaching out, not in aggression this time, but in a desperate, clawing plea. Adelaide, listen. We can fix this. The money from the valley. If you just give me the access codes to the trust, I can pay off the men in the car. I can make this go away for both of us. You don't want the police asking questions about where your friends got their information. I looked at his hand, the soft, uncalloused hand of a man who had never worked a day for what he owned. You still think this is about the money, don't you? You think I spent 12 years sitting in this chair, counting the minutes, just to get a bigger balance in a bank account I'll never fully spend. I stood up, the ledger held against my chest like a shield. The money is gone. Elijah, it was never mine to keep, and it certainly isn't yours to steal again. It's been moved through 4 different jurisdictions and ended up in the hands of the people who actually earned it. The access codes you want are currently being mailed to the district attorney's office in a very large, very heavy envelope. His face went from waxen to a sickly, mottled gray. The realization was finally sinking in. I hadn't just moved the pieces on the board. I had burned the board and built a new one while he wasn't looking. You've been planning this since the funeral, he whispered, his voice cracking. Since before the funeral, I corrected him. I began planning the moment I saw you looking at my husband's casket and calculating the resale value of his watch. I knew then that you were a predator, but you made the mistake of thinking I was the grass. I'm the deep water, Elijah, and you've been wading out too far for a very long time. A loudspeaker crackled outside. This is the police. Step out of the house with your hands visible. The black sedan at the curb didn't flee. It simply sat there, its engine a low, predatory growl. The men inside knew the police weren't there for them. Not yet. They were there to ensure Elijah didn't vanish before they could have their turn. Go on, I said, gesturing toward the door. The officers are waiting. Tell them about the legal complications. Tell them about the formalities. I'm sure they'll be fascinated by your perspective on estate law. Elijah looked at the door, then back at me. For a second, I saw a flash of the old, vicious Elijah, the one who thought he could bully his way out of any corner. He lunged toward the desk, perhaps hoping to grab the ledger, to destroy the evidence I held. I didn't move. I didn't have to. He tripped over the edge of the rug, the one he had disparaged as shabby minutes earlier. He tumbled forward, his chin hitting the edge of the mahogany desk with a sickening thud. The gold pen flew from his pocket, skittering across the floor and rolling into the shadows beneath the sofa. He groaned, clutching his jaw, blood blossoming on his white shirt like a dark flower. Careful, Elijah, I said, my voice as cold as a winter morning. Gravity is just another law you thought you were above. It catches up to everyone eventually. The front door burst open. The cool night air rushed in, smelling of rain and ozone. The officers didn't see a helpless old woman. They saw a composed homeowner standing over a bleeding, frantic intruder who was babbling about trusts and shadows. I stepped back into the darkness of the hallway, letting the light of the law find him. My work for the evening was nearly done, but the night was still young, and there were 9 more ledgers on my shelf. The officers moved with a practiced, heavy efficiency. They didn't see the history of this room. They only saw the geometry of a crime scene. To them, Elijah was a disheveled man on the floor, bleeding onto a Persian rug that had seen 50 years of quiet dignity. To them, I was a grandmotherly figure in a cardigan, perhaps a bit shaken, surely needing a glass of water and a warm word. "Ma'am, are you all right?" a young officer asked, his voice dropping into that soft, patronizing register people use for the elderly and the broken. "I am fine, officer," I said, my voice steady like a bell tolling in a distant valley. Just a bit surprised. He was very insistent about the papers. He seemed distressed. Elijah looked up from the floor, his eyes wild, blood smearing his lip. "She's lying. She set this up. The car outside, the men in the sedan, she's in league with them." The officer looked toward the window, then back at Elijah with a weary sigh. "Sir, there's no sedan outside. Just my patrol car and your own Mercedes blocked in the driveway. Now, let's get you up." Elijah froze. He scrambled to the window, pushing past the second officer to peer out into the street. The space where the black car had been idling was empty. The asphalt was slick with rain, reflecting nothing but the sterile blue of the police lights. The predators had vanished into the mist, leaving him alone with the consequences he had spent a lifetime outrunning. But they were there, Elijah whispered, his voice cracking. "I saw them. She told me they were there." "Delusions can be a symptom of extreme stress, Elijah," I said softly, stepping into the light just enough so he could see the slight cold curve of my lips. "Or perhaps a guilty conscience playing tricks on the eyes. You've been under so much pressure lately with the audit." The word audit hit him like a physical blow. He looked at the officers, then back at me, realizing the trap wasn't just physical. It was psychological. I had made him see ghosts because he was already haunted. I had used his own paranoia as a leash, and he had walked himself right into the kennel. "We found this on the floor, ma'am," the younger officer said, holding up the gold pen Elijah had dropped. "Is this yours?" "It belongs to my nephew," I said. He was quite attached to it. "It's a very expensive instrument, though I suppose not as expensive as the things he used it to sign away." They led him toward the door. He didn't fight anymore. The fight had drained out of him the moment the black sedan vanished. He realized then that he wasn't being hunted by a gang or a shadow organization. He was being dismantled by a woman who had sat in the same chair for 12 years, knitting his shroud with every stitch of her memory. As they reached the threshold, Elijah turned back. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, gnawing fear. "Why, Adelaide? Why now? You could have had the money. We could have been partners." I walked to the door, my hand resting on the heavy oak frame. "Partners, Elijah? A wolf doesn't partner with the sheep. He merely waits until he's hungry. You weren't hungry for money. You were hungry for power. You wanted to see me small. You wanted to see me fade." I leaned in closer, so only he could hear me over the idling of the squad car. "I waited 12 years because that is how long it took for the interest to compound. On the debt, Elijah, not the money. The debt of soul you owed to every person you broke. I'm just the debt collector, and I never miss a payment." The door closed with a solid, final thud. I turned the deadbolt, a sound that felt like the clicking of a puzzle box finally solved. The house was silent again. The red and blue lights faded as the patrol car pulled away, leaving the living room in the soft, amber glow of my reading lamp. I walked back to my wingback chair and sat down. The ledger was still in my lap. I opened it to the final page of the section marked Elijah. I took a simple black ballpoint pen from my side table and drew a single clean line through his name. It was a small gesture, but in the quiet of the room, it felt like an earthquake. But Elijah was only the first name on the list. I looked at the shelf where the other 9 ledgers sat, their spines glowing faintly in the lamplight. People think that when a man dies, his secrets die with him. They don't realize that a wife is the curator of a man's darkness. My husband had friends, men of stature, men of influence, men who had helped Elijah navigate the legalities of my ruin because it suited their own ledgers. I reached out and pulled the second book from the shelf. The name on the spine was embossed in fading gold, Vaughn. A knock came at the back door, not a heavy, entitled thud this time, but 3 sharp, rhythmic taps. The signal. I stood up, smoothing my apron. The night was cold, but the fire in my hearth was just beginning to catch. The back door opened to the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. Standing there was a woman who had been my shadow for a decade. Hattie was 74, with hands mapped by a lifetime of scrubbing floors in houses she could never own. Houses exactly like mine. In this neighborhood, women like Hattie are invisible. We are the help, the elderly relatives, the quiet background noise of a well-ordered life. People talk in front of us as if we are furniture. He's gone, Hattie said, her voice a low rasp. She didn't need to specify who. The car followed the police to the station. They'll wait. They have more patience than the law. Thank you, Hattie, I said, stepping aside to let her in. And the others? Positioned, she replied, taking a seat at my kitchen table with the weary grace of a queen. The ledger for Vaughn is open. He's the one who authorized the infrastructure loans that drained your husband's estate while the body was still warm. He's celebrating tonight. A retirement party at the Heights Club. I set a kettle on the stove. The click of the burner was the only sharp sound in the kitchen. A retirement party. How fitting. A man who spent 30 years building a monument to himself out of other people's bricks. He thinks he's safe, Adelaide, Hattie said, watching me. He thinks Elijah was the only loose thread. He doesn't know you've been pulling on the whole sweater. I reached for 2 ceramic mugs, not the fine china Elijah had coveted, but the sturdy ones we used when the work was hard. Vaughn is a different breed than Elijah. Elijah was greedy and loud. Vaughn is greedy and quiet. He doesn't steal with a signature. He steals with a suggestion. A friendly bit of advice over a glass of scotch. He's the one who told my husband that his heart was too weak for the stress of the business, then whispered to the board that the business was too weak for a man with a failing heart. I poured the tea. The steam rose, obscuring my reflection in the window. He didn't just take the money. He took the legacy. He took the pride. And he did it with a smile and a handshake. What's the move? Hattie asked. The Heights Club has a very specific filing system, I said, sitting across from her. Digital, modern, and entirely vulnerable to someone who knows the passwords the cleaning crew uses to bypass the security sensors. You told me the night shift supervisor is your grandson's godmother. Hattie nodded once. She's been looking for a reason to quit. This would be a very loud reason. I pushed the second ledger across the table. Inside the front cover, there is a flash drive. It contains the mirrored records of the 2014 infrastructure project, the one that resulted in a bridge that was never built and a series of offshore accounts that Vaughn thinks are untraceable. I don't want them leaked to the press. Not yet. Hattie looked at the drive. Then what? I want them printed. I said, 1 page at a time. And I want those pages tucked into the menus at his retirement dinner tonight. Between the appetizer and the main course, I want every guest at that table to see exactly what funded their wine. The tension in the room shifted. This wasn't the chaotic downfall of a man like Elijah. This was the surgical dismantling of a reputation. For a man like Vaughn, social death was worse than a prison cell. He lived for the respect of his peers, for the way people lowered their voices when he entered a room. "He'll know it was you?" Hattie cautioned. "No," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "He'll think it was Elijah. Elijah, who just got arrested. Elijah, who is desperate and looking for someone to drag down with him. I'm just the ghost in the machine. Hattie, a ghost he forgot to exorcise." I looked out the window at the dark street. The black sedan was gone, but the ripples it had started were turning into a tide. 12 years of silence is a long time to build a reservoir. When the dam finally breaks, it doesn't make a sound. It just drowns everything in its path. Vaughn thinks he's the architect, I whispered, but he forgot that every building needs a foundation, and I've been digging under his for a very, very long time. Hattie stood up, tucked the ledger under her arm, and vanished back into the night. I stayed at the table, the tea growing cold in my hand. One name crossed out, one name highlighted in gold. The game was escalating, and for the first time in a decade, I felt truly alive. The Heights Club was a place where the walls were thick enough to muffle the sound of a crumbling conscience. It sat atop the city like a crown of cold stone, accessible only to those with the right pedigree or a sufficiently padded bank account. Vaughn loved it there. He loved the way the servers moved like shadows, and the way the chandeliers cast a golden glow that made even the most crooked men look honorable. Hattie's goddaughter, a woman named Elena with eyes that saw far more than she ever spoke, moved through the banquet hall with the practiced grace of the invisible. To the men in tuxedos, she was merely a hand that refilled a water glass or cleared a bread plate. She was part of the plumbing. Vaughn sat at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by the pillars of the community. There were judges, developers, and city council members, all of them beneficiaries of the quiet arrangements he had spent 30 years orchestrating. They were raising their glasses to his distinguished career, to his unwavering integrity. I sat in my darkened living room, 5 miles away, watching the time on the mantel clock. I didn't need to be there to see the color drain from his face. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind for 4,000 nights. At exactly 8:15 p.m., the menus were distributed. They were heavy cream-colored cardstock, embossed with the club's crest. But inside, tucked behind the list of dry-aged steaks and vintage Bordeaux, was a single sheet of thermal paper. It wasn't a menu. It was a ledger entry from 2014, the Bridge to Nowhere project. I could almost hear the collective intake of breath. A man like Vaughn doesn't fear the police. He fears the redirected gaze of his peers. He fears the moment the pillars realize the roof is about to fall on them. 2. Elena told Hattie later that the silence at the table was so heavy it felt like it might crack the floorboards. Vaughn opened his menu, his hand steady at first, until his eyes hit the line item labeled disbursement, Cayman/Von Sub-A CCT4. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. That was for men like Elijah. Vaughn simply closed the menu, his knuckles turning white. He looked around the table, searching for an ally. But every man there was suddenly very interested in the texture of their linen napkins. They knew that paper. They knew those numbers. And they knew that if Vaughn was being exposed, they were only a few pages away from the same fate. "Is there a problem, Jerry?" the judge sitting to his left asked, his voice clipped and cold. "A mistake," Vaughn managed to say, though his voice sounded like it was being squeezed through a narrow pipe. "A clerical error from the kitchen." He stood up, intending to find the manager, to exert the influence he had cultivated for decades. But as he turned toward the door, he saw a figure standing in the shadows of the service entrance. It wasn't me. It was Hattie, wearing her cleaning uniform, holding a mop bucket, as if she were waiting for a spill. She didn't move. She just looked at him. And in that look, Vaughn saw 12 years of invisible eyes. He saw every floor she had scrubbed while he discussed restructuring his friends' lives. He saw every trash can she had emptied that contained the shredded remnants of his lies. He realized then that he wasn't being attacked by a rival or a whistleblower. He was being dismantled by the very people he thought were too lowly to notice him. He sat back down, his legs suddenly failing him. He looked at the menu again, and there, at the very bottom of the page, in a handwriting he hadn't seen since my husband's funeral, were 4 words. "The foundation is hollow." I stood up from my wingback chair and walked to the kitchen to pour the rest of the tea. The first name had been a physical removal. The second was social execution. Vaughn would spend the rest of his retirement looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next page to drop, knowing that his peers were now his predators. I looked at the third ledger on my shelf. The name was Lee Anderson, the man who had handled the actual wire transfers, the man who thought he was the smartest person in the room because he knew how to hide money in the light. 2 down, I whispered to the empty house. And the night is still so very long. The third ledger was bound in a skin of cold, blue leather. Unlike Elijah's mess of greed or Vaughn's vanity, the entries here were sterile, precise. They were the work of a man who believed that if you balance a column of figures perfectly, the morality of how those figures arrive there ceases to exist. Avery was a man of cold stone and high-thread count shirts. As the lead auditor for the firm that handled my husband's estate, he was the one who had provided the mathematical certainty that I was destitute. He was the one who sat in my kitchen 12 years ago, sipping my tea and explaining with a sympathetic tilt of his head that numbers don't have feelings, Mrs. Adelaide. I remember the way he looked at my wedding ring that day, not with compassion, but as if he were mentally calculating the carat weight and the resale value at a pawn shop on the edge of town. Numbers might not have feelings, Avery, I whispered to the empty room as I opened the book, but they have a very long memory. Avery's weakness wasn't women or wine, it was order. He lived his life by a rigid set of algorithms. He took the same train at 7:02 a.m. He ate the same Cobb salad at the same bistro at 12:15 p.m. He believed that because he was predictable, he was safe. He thought that by hiding behind a wall of complexity, he was invisible. But complexity is just a series of simple things stacked on top of each other. And if you know which brick to pull, the whole wall becomes a pile of dust. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a small silver key. It didn't look like much, just a standard locker key from the downtown transit hub. But this key opened a box that hadn't been touched in a decade. Inside that box was a ledger Avery thought he had shredded in 2014, a shadow book he kept to ensure he could blackmail Vaughn and Elijah if they ever turned on him. He had forgotten that I was the one who cleaned his office back then. Not because I had to, but because I knew the cleaning crew was understaffed and overworked. I had put on a gray smock, tied my hair back, and spent 6 months emptying his trash. I didn't find the ledger in the shredder. I found it in the lining of an old briefcase he had tossed out because the latch was sticky. He thought he was discarding trash. He was discarding his life. I picked up my rotary phone, the only one in the house, a heavy black thing that felt like an anchor. I dialed a number I had memorized years ago. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the press. It was a man named Jerry who ran a very small, very private debt collection agency specializing in unconventional assets. "It's time," I said when he picked up. No greeting. No pleasantries. The auditor. Jerry's voice was like gravel shifting in a pan. "The auditor. He's at the bistro now. Table 4. He'll have his briefcase on the chair next to him. Inside, he has the quarterly reports for the city pension fund. He's about to adjust them for the final time before he retires. And the key is in the flower pot outside the station. Locker 402. Give him a copy of page 64. Just page 64. The one with the signatures he forged. I hung up. Avery lived for the clean finish. He wanted to walk away with his pension and his reputation intact, leaving a trail of broken lives behind him that looked like nothing more than a series of unfortunate market fluctuations. But I wasn't giving him a clean finish. I was giving him the one thing a man of logic cannot handle, an unsolvable variable. I walked to the window and watched a stray cat pick its way across the frozen lawn. It moved with a quiet, lethal intent. It didn't meow. It didn't hiss. It just waited for the right moment to strike. In 30 minutes, Avery would be handed a piece of paper by a stranger. He would look at his own forged signature from 12 years ago, a signature he thought had been turned into confetti. He would realize that the lovely Mrs. Adelaide wasn't just a widow he had outmaneuvered. He would realize I was the auditor of his soul, and I had found a massive discrepancy. The 12:15 p.m. sun hit the windows of the bistro with a clinical white glare. Through the lens of the small brass telescope I kept hidden behind the parlor ivy, I could see the silhouette of Avery. He was a man of sharp angles, straight spine, creased trousers, and a face that looked like it had been carved from a bar of unscented soap. He was cutting his Cobb salad into precise, identical squares. Order. It was his religion. Jerry's man, a nondescript fellow in a delivery jacket, approached the table. There was no drama, no hushed whispers. He simply set a small, white envelope next to Avery's sparkling water and walked away. Avery didn't look up immediately. He finished his mouthful of greens, wiped his thin lips with a linen napkin, and then, only then, did he slide a silver letter opener through the seal. I watched through the glass. Even from 5 miles away, I felt the shift in the air. Avery didn't gasp. He didn't jump. He simply stopped moving. He became a gargoyle. Page 64 was a mirror, reflecting a version of himself he thought he'd buried under a decade of legitimate filings. It was the adjustment for contingency, the internal memo where he'd authorized the siphoning of my husband's medical trust into a shell company controlled by Vaughn. His signature was there, looping and arrogant. Beneath it, in my own steady, clear hand, I had written a single date. Next Tuesday. The next Tuesday wasn't a threat of violence. It was the date of the state's annual fiscal review. Avery was the keynote speaker. He was supposed to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for transparency in private accounting. I pulled back from the telescope and sat in the dimness of my hallway. The house felt like it was breathing with me. Avery would spend the next 6 days trying to find the source. He would audit his own files. He would look at his encrypted drives. He would search for a ghost in his system. But you cannot find a ghost that lives in a gray smock and a pair of sensible shoes. You cannot find a ghost that emptied your trash every Tuesday night for 6 months while you were busy calculating the profit of a widow's grief. The phone rang. I let it ring 4 times before I picked up. Adelaide. The voice was thin, like a wire being pulled tight. It was Avery. He sounded older. I know you have something. I don't know how, but I know it's you. I have many things, Avery, I said, my voice a soft, rhythmic hum. I have a garden that needs weeding. I have a book I'm halfway through. And I have a very clear memory of the day you told me my husband's life work had evaporated into the market. What do you want? He hissed. Money? I can get you more than what was in that trust. 10 times more. Money is just paper. Avery, you of all people should know how easily paper burns. I don't want your money. I want your certainty. I don't understand. I want you to go to that podium on Tuesday, I said, leaning my head against the cool wallpaper. I want you to look at the men who are giving you that award. And I want you to wonder, with every word you speak, which one of them I've already spoken to. I want you to look at the doors and wonder if the auditors are standing behind them. I want you to feel the math failing you, Avery, just like it failed me when I needed it most. I hung up before he could reply. There is a specific kind of torture for a man who lives by logic. It is the introduction of a variable he cannot control. For the next week, every person Avery saw would be a potential betrayer. Every phone call would be a threat. He would dismantle his own life piece by piece, searching for a leak that didn't exist in the plumbing, but in the foundation. I looked at the fourth ledger. The name was Lee Anderson, the man who had moved the money, the one who thought digital shadows were deeper than physical ones. The math is never wrong, Avery, I whispered to the quiet hallway. It just hasn't reached the final sum yet. The ninth ledger was different. It wasn't paper at all, but a sleek obsidian tablet tucked into a hollowed-out book of Victorian poetry. This was the world of Lee Anderson, a man who believed that if a crime didn't leave an ink stain, it didn't happen. He was the youngest of the circle, a digital architect who had moved my husband's life savings through a labyrinth of encrypted servers and ghost accounts until the money simply evaporated. Lee Anderson lived in a glass penthouse that overlooked the city like a watchtower. He dealt in high-frequency trading and proprietary algorithms. He thought his brilliance was a shield that no 70-year-old woman could ever pierce. He saw me as a woman who likely struggled to program a microwave. What he didn't know was that I didn't need to understand his code. I only needed to understand his shadow. He thinks the cloud is a vault, I said to Hattie as she sat in my kitchen, polishing a set of silver spoons that hadn't seen the light in a decade. He thinks because he can't touch the money, no one else can either. He's flashy, Adelaide, Hattie remarked, her eyes narrowing. New money always makes too much noise. He just bought a yacht, named it the Sovereign. A sovereign is a coin, Hattie, and every coin has two sides. He's forgotten the flip side of his own success. Lee Anderson's weakness was his ego. He loved to show off his unhackable systems. Every month, he hosted a private alpha gala for the city's tech elite. He would demonstrate his latest security protocols by inviting guests to try and find a single error in a dummy ledger. It was a game to him, a way to prove he was the smartest god in a heaven of his own making. I reached into my sewing basket and pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive. It had been given to me by a young man named Leo, a boy the neighborhood had written off as a troublemaker, but whom I had seen as a mathematical prodigy. I had paid for his tuition at a technical institute 4 years ago, long before Elijah ever knocked on my door. Is it ready? I asked. Leo says it's a Trojan horse with a very slow fuse, Hattie replied. He said you don't even have to plug it in. You just have to be near his network for 10 seconds. I looked at my reflection in the darkened kitchen window. I didn't look like a cyber terrorist. I looked like a woman going to a gala. I had an invitation, of course. Vaughn had sent it to my husband years ago as a cruel joke, a gold-tier, lifetime membership to a club we were no longer supposed to afford. They had forgotten to revoke the access codes. On Friday night, I wore my best silk dress, the deep plum one I had saved for a victory I wasn't sure would ever come. I walked into that glass tower, my sensible heels clicking softly on the marble. Lee Anderson was there, a glass of champagne in one hand, a tablet in the other, holding court. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? To him, I was just another legacy guest, a relic of the old guard brought in to provide a sense of history to his neon-lit future. I walked past his main server hub, a shimmering pillar of blue light in the center of the room. I paused for a moment, adjusted my shawl, and let my handbag brush against the proximity sensor. 10 seconds. The drive in my bag didn't steal his money. It didn't crash his system. It did something far more elegant. It introduced a micro-lag, a delay of exactly 1,000th of a second in his high-frequency trading algorithm. In his world, 1,000th of a second is an eternity. It is the difference between $1 billion profit and a catastrophic cascade of failed trades. I watched him from across the room as he laughed at a joke. He was so confident, so certain of his own frictionless world. He didn't feel the ghost in the machine. He didn't see the tiny, invisible crack I had just placed in his glass ceiling. "Enjoy the view, Mr. Lee Anderson," I whispered into my glass of sparkling water. It's a long way down when the floor starts to move slower than the air. I finished my drink and left before the first red light on his console began to blink. By the time he realized his unhackable vault was leaking time, I would be back in my wingback chair listening to the rain. By Saturday morning, the glass tower was no longer a watchtower. It was a pressure cooker. High-frequency trading relies on the illusion of instantaneous time. When that 1,000th of a second went missing, the algorithms began to cannibalize themselves. They saw discrepancies where there should have been parity. They executed trades based on data that was already a heartbeat old. From my kitchen table, I watched the financial news on a small, flickering television. The anchor spoke in hushed, panicked tones about a flash anomaly in the mid-market tech sector. They didn't have a name for it yet. They called it a glitch. I called it justice. "He's hemorrhaging," Hattie said, stepping into the kitchen with a basket of fresh laundry, the universal camouflage of a woman who knows everyone's business. The board of directors is at the penthouse. They're demanding to see the cold storage logs. They think he's been skimming to cover his own losses. "He hasn't," I said, sipping my coffee. "That's the beauty of it. He's perfectly honest in his thievery. But because the timing is off, his honesty looks like fraud. He can't explain the gap because he doesn't believe in ghosts." The phone rang. I knew it wouldn't be Elijah or Vaughn this time. They were already drowning in their own respective oceans. This would be the man who thought he was a god. I picked up. The silence on the other end was heavy, punctuated only by the sound of rapid, shallow breathing. "Who are you?" he finally asked. His voice wasn't the smooth, polished baritone from the gala. It was thin, reedy, stripped of its digital armor. "I am the woman who stood next to your server for 10 seconds, Mr. Lee Anderson," I said. "I am the woman who remembers when a handshake was worth more than a fiber optic cable." "What did you do?" "My engineers can't find a virus. There's no breach. But the clock is wrong." "The clock isn't wrong," I replied, leaning back and looking at the dust motes dancing in a shaft of morning light. "The world is just moving at a pace you can no longer afford. You spent 12 years moving money so fast that the blood on it didn't have time to dry. I simply slowed it down, so you'd have to look at it." "I can fix it," he stammered. "I'll give it back. Whatever you lost, I'll triple it. Just tell me how to sync the servers." "You can't sync a soul, Avery," I said, using the name of the auditor to remind him that the walls were closing in from all sides. "You're all connected now. Elijah is in a cell, Vaughn is a social leper, and you are a man who can't keep time. And in your world, time is the only thing that exists." I hung up. I walked to the hallway and looked at the last 2 ledgers. They didn't have names on the spines. They were blank. They were for the men I hadn't met yet, the ones who had stayed in the shadows, letting the 3 musketeers of greed do the dirty work, the silent partners. But shadows only work if there's no light, and I was about to turn on every lamp in the house. I took a pair of garden shears from the drawer. It was time to prune the roses. They had grown too wild, thinking they owned the trellis. They forgot that the gardener is the one who decides what lives and what is returned to the dirt. One more move. I whispered to the empty hallway. One more knock on the door. The final 2 ledgers were not filled with numbers or names. They were filled with maps. Not maps of streets or estates, but maps of influence, the delicate, invisible threads that connected the greed of Elijah, the vanity of Vaughn, and the cold calculations of the auditor. For 12 years, I had traced these threads back to a single, quiet center. Every predator has a protector. Every thief has a banker who looks the other way. I sat on my porch as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across Oakhaven Drive. The air was turning brittle with the coming frost. I held a small silver bell in my hand, a trinket from a forgotten anniversary. I rang it once, a clear, lonely sound that cut through the evening stillness. "He's coming," Hattie said, appearing from the side of the house like a part of the evening mist. She was dressed in her best black coat, the one she wore to funerals. "He thinks he's coming to clean up the mess," I said. "He thinks with the others neutralized, he can simply sweep the shards under the rug and move on. He doesn't realize the rug has been pulled out from under him already." The car that pulled up wasn't a flashy Mercedes or a tinted sedan. It was a modest, dark blue station wagon, the kind of vehicle a man drives when he wants to blend into the background of a grocery store parking lot. The man who stepped out was soft-featured, with spectacles and a kind smile. This was Jerry, not my debt collector, but the other Jerry, the chairman of the ethics committee, the man who had overseen every investigation into the missing funds and found no evidence of wrongdoing. He walked up my path with a basket of muffins, a peace offering, a shroud made of blueberries and sugar. "Adelaide," he said, his voice like velvet, "I heard about the trouble with Elijah and the unfortunate rumors surrounding Vaughn. I came to see if you needed anything. It's a heavy burden for a woman of your years to carry alone." "The only thing heavy in this house, Jerry, is the truth," I said, gesturing to the chair beside me. "But please sit. The view of the sunset is particularly sharp tonight." He sat, placing the basket on the small wicker table between us. He looked out at the street, his expression one of paternal concern. "I've spent my life protecting this community, Adelaide, protecting people like you from the complications of the world. It pained me to see what happened to your husband's legacy. It pained you so much that you took a 15% oversight fee from every dollar that disappeared." I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a landslide. Jerry didn't flinch. He didn't turn his head. His smile remained, but it became fixed like a drawing on a balloon. "That's a very serious accusation, Adelaide, one that requires a great deal of documentation." "I have 12 years of documentation. Jerry, I didn't just watch the boys play in the mud. I watched who gave them the shovels. I watched who washed their clothes afterward. I watched you sign the conflict of interest waivers that you thought were shredded in the city basement." I reached into my knitting bag and pulled out a single photograph. It wasn't of a ledger. It was a photo of Jerry, 10 years ago, standing on the deck of a boat that didn't belong to him, shaking hands with the man who had sold my husband the faulty heart valves that started his decline. "You weren't just the protector, Jerry," I said. "You were the architect. Elijah was the muscle, Vaughn was the face, and the auditor was the pen. But you were the silence that made it all possible." The kind man disappeared. The eyes behind the spectacles turned into chips of flint. He leaned in, the smell of peppermint and rot surrounding him. "And what do you think you're going to do with a photograph and some old papers? I am the committee, Adelaide. I am the law in this town. You're an old woman in a drafty house. If you speak, people will call it dementia. If you persist, people will call it a tragedy when you trip on these steep porch stairs." I rang the silver bell again. From the shadows of the neighboring houses, figures began to emerge. Not the police, not the press, but the people of Oakhaven, The gardeners, the maids, the retired postmen, the widows, dozens of them, standing on the sidewalk, silent and observant. They all held their phones up, the small glowing screens acting as 100 digital eyes. "I'm not speaking to the law, Jerry," I said, standing up with a strength that made him recoil. "I'm speaking to the neighbors. You see, a man like you can survive a courtroom. You can bribe a judge, but you cannot survive the silence of a neighborhood that knows exactly who you are." Hattie stepped forward, holding a tablet. "The live stream has 3,000 viewers, Jerry. Your daughter is watching from her dorm. Your wife is watching from the charity gala. The oversight is finally over." Jerry looked at the crowd. He looked at the glowing screens. He looked at me, and for the first time in his long protected life, he saw the inevitable. He wasn't being arrested. He was being erased. "You waited 12 years for this," he hissed, his voice trembling with a sudden, icy realization. "No," I said, smoothing my apron. "I waited 12 years for the frost. It makes the cleanup so much easier when everything is already frozen solid." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a kingdom falling without a single shot being fired. The blue station wagon didn't speed away. Jerry sat in the driver's seat for a long time, his headlights cutting twin tunnels into the rising mist. He looked at the neighbors standing on the sidewalk, the people he had waved to for a decade, the people whose children he had seen grow up. Not a single one of them moved. They didn't shout. They didn't throw stones. They simply watched him with the cold, unblinking eyes of a jury that had already reached its verdict. When he finally pulled away, he drove slowly, as if he were steering a funeral hearse. His own. "It's done, Adelaide," Hattie said, her voice soft as the evening air. She reached out and took the silver bell from my hand. "The stream is saved. The files are with the people who can't be bought because they've already lost everything to men like him." "It's never truly done, Hattie," I replied, looking at the empty space where the car had been. "But the weeds have been pulled. The soil is clear for a while." I walked back into my house and closed the door. For 12 years, this house had felt like a fortress, a place of maps, ledgers, and whispered strategies. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like a home again. The shadows weren't hiding secrets anymore. They were just shadows. I went to the study and looked at the shelf. 12 ledgers. I took them down, one by one, and carried them to the hearth. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline or a surge of heat. I felt a profound, heavy stillness. I struck a single match. The paper caught quickly. The ink of the forgeries, the records of the stolen trusts, the maps of Jerry's influence, they all curled into blackened petals of ash. I watched the names of the men who thought they were giants dissolve into smoke. They had spent their lives building monuments of paper, never realizing how easily paper returns to the earth. People ask why I waited 12 years. They think revenge is a dish best served cold, but they don't understand the temperature. It isn't about ice. It's about the slow, steady burn of a coal that refuses to go out. If I had struck too soon, they would have replaced each other. If I had shouted, they would have silenced me. But by waiting, I became the one thing they couldn't account for. A constant. The fire died down to a soft, orange glow. I picked up the last ledger, the one with no name. I didn't burn this one. I opened it to the first page and wrote a single line in my steady accountant's hand. The ledger is balanced. I walked to the kitchen and poured a final glass of water. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet again. The digital eyes had gone dark, the neighbors had returned to their beds, and the city hummed with a different frequency. The lovely Mrs. Adelaide was still here. I would still bake my lemon tarts. I would still trim my hedges to the exact inch required by the bylaws. But tomorrow, when the sun rises, the men who once owned the air will find it very hard to breathe. They will look at the elderly women on their porches, the cleaners in their offices, and the quiet widows in the back rows of their churches. And they will wonder who else has been keeping a ledger. They will wonder if the ghost in the machine is finally finished with them. I set the glass down and turned off the kitchen light. Every old person knows what it is to be young, but not all young people know what it means to be old. They think we are fading. They think we are losing our grip. They don't realize that the older you get, the less you have to lose, and that makes you the most dangerous person in the room. The house was silent. The debt was paid. And for the first time in 12 years, I slept without dreaming of the math. A story of patience is a story of power. If you felt the weight of every year Adelaide waited, make sure to subscribe to Twilight Vendetta. We don't just tell stories, we balance the scales. What would you do if you had 12 years to plan? Tell me in the comments. I'm listening.